this tutorial, I'm going to show you that it doesn't take a crazy scene setup or build to create a dynamic final image. Hey everyone, I'm David Rickels, a creative director and 3D motion graphic artist, and I'm thrilled to be back with School of Motion for another Cinema 4D tutorial. In this one, we're actually going to be breaking down a client project I finished a little over a year ago, which to me shows just how being a little bit clever can really make a simple scene look incredibly dynamic. We're going to construct our scene using splines, clones, and utilizing the power of Redshift. And then we're going to take all those renders and import them into After Effects just to give that little extra touch in post. And of course, I'm going to do my best to pepper in lots of little extra tips and tricks along the way.
Be sure to download the project file so you can follow along. Link is in the description.
All right, first up, we're going to build our hero tube segment, keeping it fairly parametric and using some reasonably controllable parametric techniques, so that way we can kind of adjust as we want to as we go through everything. Before we get into that, we're going to set up our project. One thing you'll notice right away is I do have sort of a default folder structure here. I also actually have some layers that I've pre-built in. This is a project structure that I typically will build and then replace my default scene. So that way, every time I open up a new project inside of Cinema 4D, this stuff is just set and ready to go. Easy way to do that is get this built and then go to Window, Customization, and Save as Default Scene. And that'll make sure that, again, every new project, this stuff is up and ready to go. You can always clear out the scene from the project files that you could download here to follow along. You can always clear out the details and save this if you like this sort of setup for your own workflows. Just wanted to throw that quick little extra out there. All right, so hitting Command or Control D on the keyboard, we are going to set up our project to be 24 frames a second. We are going to work at 120 frames total max time, so that's roughly 5 seconds. We are going to jump this into OpenColor.io workflow. That way we are working in ACES CG. The reason for that is there's going to be a lot of highlights and shadows, a lot of detail reflections, and a lot of color, and I want to be able to control all of those with a little bit of extra finite precision in post once we move this to After Effects. Honestly, you could work in sRGB, you could work in whatever color management pipeline you want to with this. This is just how I set it up. I did go over the OCIO color management in my previous tutorial for School of Motion, both through Cinema 4D and After Effects. That one was pretty in-depth, so I'm not going to go to nearly as much depth here. If you are interested in learning a little bit more, I would strongly recommend you jump over to the last tutorial that I did for School of Motion to learn all about it. All right, I think I've gotten all the staging out of the way, so let's get to actually building this thing. First thing I'm going to do in my scene is add in just a basic cube. Throw that into my geometry folder. A couple quick modifications to the cube. We're going to set this to be 25 centimeters on the X. We're going to set it to be 35 on the Y, and then a very long 850 centimeters on the Z. We are going to keep this at one segment on both the X and Y, but we are going to up the segments on Z to 30. If I go into hidden line mode as we're building this, you'll be able to see with a little more detail what's happening here. I'm adding segments to the Z because I'm envisioning this path running down the Z plane, so I need some extra segments to handle deformation there so it stays relatively smooth and doesn't look too faceted. I am going to check the fillet box option. I'm going to leave this all at default for right now. Again, this is a set of parametric controls. We're not going to collapse this into firm geometry, so we can always go back and adjust later. All right, I'm going to throw in a cloner object. If you hold down Alt on the keyboard while you have an object selected, that'll make whatever you click on become the parent. So that's why the cloner just immediately went to the parent here. We're going to call this the main tube segment. I'm going to switch this to radial mode. I'm going to change the plane to be the XY plane so that it's running down the Z axis. I'm going to increase the count to 36, and I'm going to increase the radius to 150. That way I have kind of a nice faceted looking tube on the interior. I really hate seeing this work plane as I'm going, so I'm going to go to filter and turn off work plane. That's just going to hide this grid. I'm also going to go back to filter, and I'm going to turn off the world axis. I generally know what direction I'm working at this point, so I don't really need to see all of these little viewport helpers. Last thing we're going to do to kind of create our hero segment is create a little bit of a coupler right on the end here, just to make sure that as I clone these down a spline in a moment, I have something that'll kind of hide some of the seams, hide some of the edges. Really simple. I'm going to just drop in a tube primitive. I'm going to bring this to the end. I'm going to switch its orientation to +Z. My outer radius doesn't matter nearly as much as the inner radius, so I'm just going to kind of pull the outer radius out. I'm going to kind of overlap this ever so slightly just to make sure I'm good there. Then I'm going to go inside of my tube. And kind of align my camera here, go inside of my tube, and I'm going to pull the inner radius. Again, I'm doing this pretty non-scientifically, but pull the inner radius out. We'll pull these to whole numbers here. We'll just set that to 200 because, again, it doesn't matter all that much. We'll do 115 on the inner radius. On the rotation segments, if you remember, we had 36 clones in the cloner, so I'm just going to set this to 36 segments. in rotation, and you'll see there, you can see here a little bit, the orientation is just a little bit off. We can always correct that, but that'll keep the segmentation in alignment, again, as we clone down the path. Just one small little detail to always keep in the back of your mind as you're working is trying to keep all of these plane segments and all of these sort of long runs aligned as best you can. I don't think we need this quite thick of a coupler here. I'm going to drop the height segment. We'll just set it to 50. That'll be a nice, easy number. And again, I'm going to just kind of realign this back so that it kind of intersects. And then we'll jump back into our tube one more time. All right, there we go. I don't need all of these interior segments, so I'm going to drop the height segments down to 1, and I am going to hit the fillet option. That way I have a nice rounded curve on the outside. All right, well, we could leave this here, but let's be honest, a little bit of detail goes a long way. So I'm going to just show you a quick method to add a little bit of detail, and I would strongly recommend you make this as detailed as you want to be. That little extra bits of detail will not be lost, even as the camera is just flying through the tube. That's actually why we made a cloned tube of individual squares, so we could get all these nice edges. That is going to show up a lot, even as the camera is flying through, but that little extra hit of detail, that little extra bit of interest is really going to go a long way to adding some visual complexity and contrast into your animation. So rather than just keeping it basic, we're going to add a little bit here. Again, I would strongly recommend you artistically freelance a little bit on your own and make this as detailed as you want. But a very quick process here. I'm going to hit C on the keyboard to collapse the primitive into real geometry. I'm going to hit UL on the keyboard to go into loop selection mode and make sure I'm in polygon selection mode. I'm then going to grab the interfaces of this tube. And then if I hit MW on the keyboard, that's going to open up the inner extrude tool. If I drag one direction, it'll extrude towards the inside of those polygons. If I drag to the other direction, it's going to extrude outer. I want to go in just a little bit, and then I'm going to go MT on the keyboard to pull out the extrude tool. Same thing. If I go one direction, it extrudes one way. If I go the other direction, it goes the other. We're going to extrude this down just ever so slightly. And then we're going to do another extrude inner, pull this back inside. We'll do another extrude tool, pull this up. So now we've actually created a little bit of a divot and then an extrude upward. We're going to do that one more time. So MW, pull this a little bit in. MT to pull this a little bit out. MW to pull this a little bit in. And then MT to pull this back up. And now if I take a little bit of a different camera angle so we can see what we just made here, you can sort of see, maybe if I go back to NA, yeah, you can sort of see I kind of created these troughs inside of this coupler. And in my mind, we're going to use these troughs to be environment lighting or to look illuminated as though it's a light inside of this tube. If I go back NF to the polygon or hidden line mode, go to UL, we're going to make sure that we can do that by selecting these loops. I'm going to group them. So the outer loops are going to be one light color. The inner loops will be another. So if I select those, and then in the commander, I do Shift-C to open the commander, and I do Store, Selection, and you want to make sure that you're not grabbing the node operator, but the Mesh Spline option. Just double click on it. That'll add a selection tag, and now this is stored, and I can apply the selection tag to a material to restrict the material only to those polygons. We're going to do this one more time on these on the second set of segments. I'm just going to make sure I have deselected that tag, but make sure that I've got these selections one more time. Store selection. If you just do Shift-C again, it should actually save whatever your last type command was. Double click on it one more time, and now I've got both these tags available to me. All right, so now I've basically got my hero segment made, and if I group them, I'm just going to call this hero tube segment. And now I'm ready to actually build the entire length of my tube. Very simply, we're going to do this, again, in the vein of trying to keep this as parametric as possible. I'm going to actually go to my overhead view, and I'm going to zoom out quite a bit here. I'm going to turn off the hero segment for right now. I don't really need to see it, but then I am going to make sure I'm in object mode. I'm going to grab the spline pen. And I'm going to start roughly at the origin point here. You can see where the origin is just in the overhead. I'm just going to put my first keyframe there, and I'm just going to drag a little bit out. And then I'm going to move a little bit in Z and click and drag, and that'll kind of create a Bezier. And then we're going to do this one more to this direction, one more to a little positive X, and then one more back to a brown negative X. And now I've created this long spline in Z, but I do want to offset some height a little bit. So because I did those drags, the Bezier handles exist, which is great. And now I can just kind of come in and grab these intermediate points, sort of these interior points, and just drag them up a little bit. Maybe grab this guy, and we'll push it down a little bit. And And really from there, I just want to make sure that my alignment feels pretty good in terms of these first and last points. And I can always press this to be extreme, and I can always grab these and modify them a little bit. But what I mean when I say alignment is I want to actually align the handles so that the rotation feels kind of clean. That's my choice on this. Again, feel free to make this however you want, but we'll kind of accentuate there. And then again, because we added this one on the first handle, we'll kind of drag down a little bit there. So now we kind of have this winding tube that has a little bit of height variation and a little bit of lateral or horizontal variation as well. And again, we can minutia this quite a bit and endlessly. Because this is going to stay parametric, we can always adjust the spline down the line if we're not happy with the results. All right, so the spline's made. We'll call this Tube Hero Spline. I'm going to drop this into my geometry folder as well. Now I'm going to grab my hero segment, unhide it, which, by the way, if you hold down Alt or Option and then click on the stoplights, you'll actually select both, and you can cycle through the green, red, or neutral positions for those stoplights. So if you see me doing that, or you see me clicking and that's what's happening, that's how I'm doing it. All right, I'm going to grab a cloner object one more time. I'm going to pull this into my geometry, and then I'm going to drop my hero tube segment group under that cloner, and I'm just going to call this hero tube. I'm going to switch this from grid mode to linear mode. I'm going to change the offset so it's not offsetting in Y, but it is offsetting in Z. And I just want to pull it, if I come in a little closer here so we can see, I just want to pull it so that it's overlapping on the coupler, but sort of extending in the offset just a little bit. And again, this is where that coupler comes in handy, is it's basically closing up any of the seams between each of these cloned pipe segments. We are going to increase the clone count. We will just add, we'll go with 12 for right now. Again, we're going to keep this parametric, so we're not going to worry about this right now. We can always adjust as we go. And then we're going to throw this into a null object, or Alt or Option G, just to make sure that it's inside of a group. And we're going to call this Hero Tube Swept. And then we are going to add in a spline wrap object. Again, Shift-C on the keyboard to open up the commander, grab a spline wrap object. I'm going to make that a child of the group, and then I'm going to use this spline that we drew, and I'm going to drop it into the spline well here. Now, right away, it comes in incorrectly. It's trying to align this spline wrap along the x-axis. We are running down the z-axis, so we just need to change this to one of the z-axes. Plus or minus, it will, that's really up to you. It really is more about whether it orders at the start position here or the start position here. We're going to go plus z so that it's kind of open, and then it runs to this coupler at the end. But you can see very nicely, now our clones are running down this spline, and we've very effectively created this tube. Now, a moment of pause on the tutorial here, but just to point out, this is a super versatile technique to create long runs of something. And you'll see even more in a moment how this can actually aid in the camera production and camera animation of trying to flow through an environment or a scene. A lot of amazing animation can be made just by simply building one segment or two segments or even three segments and all just dropping them in a cloner and then wrapping them down a spline that you've drawn to create some visual complexity and pathing. Strong recommendation that you play around with this technique and really begin to put it into your workflow for any type of builds that require some kind of an effect like what we're trying to build here. But it is as simple as what we just did to kind of craft, and that's why I want to point it out. It's a super versatile, amazing technique.
All right, now that our basic model is set, it's really time to start thinking through the texturing and lighting of our scene. Now, if you take a look at the reference material, you'll notice that actually it's a highly reflective texture that's wrapping around the tube. And I chose this approach intentionally because it really offered up the opportunity for a very high energy, bright and vibrant atmosphere once all the lights and illumination were set in scene. But working with mirrors actually does introduce some complexity. Unlike working with, say, a concrete or wood texture where light will hit that surface and diffuse across it or scatter across it, mirrors really rely solely on reflection to be visible. So we're going to think about this a little bit closer to using a mirror box than we are traditional lighting. Now, what is a mirror box? Well, there's a lot of tutorials out there that you can learn about mirror boxes specifically, including a great one on School of Motion. But in essence, it's an enclosed environment that is highly reflective where maybe you'll put a bright illuminated object in the center of that space, and it's just going to reflect and bounce off of every single surface that is mirrored. And it creates a really cool dynamic result. We're going to use the same theory of this technique, but instead of it being a box, the tube is kind of our surrounding geometry. And we're going to take emissive objects and scatter them down the tube, and because they're emissive, they will appear as though they're light sources within the tube and help craft this very high energy look and feel. What does this all mean? How does it come together? Let's show you.
First thing we're going to do is actually come inside of the tube, and we are going to add a cube object into the scene. Maybe I shouldn't have gone into the tube quite yet. We're going to add a cube object into the scene. We're going to actually shrink it down quite a bit. We really just need this to be a little bit small. We're going to extend the Z. We do not need a ton of segments here. And then we're going to drop this into a cloner object. We are going to switch the cloner object to radial. We are going to set it to be XY as well. So actually, we're starting to basically rebuild this main tube segment just a little bit. We are going to keep the radius pretty slim, so 50 can work for right now. Maybe somewhere 50 to 80 is going to be good. We're going to reduce the count to 3, just so we have a few objects, but not a ton. And then we're just going to very simply drop this inside of the Hero Tube segment group. And now basically what we've done is if we go into the tube, we've added all of this geometry inside of it. We are going to add an emissive material to this, so we're going to come to Materials, go to Standard, come all the way down on this to the Emission tab, and we're going to kind of create just an electric orange kind of color. And we will turn this on at least to 1. We're just going to set it to 1 for right now. And I don't really need any other properties. I don't need any kind of albedo. I don't need any reflection or kind of diffuse property. I don't need any reflection property. This is meant to be a purely illuminated object. So I'm going to drop that onto this cloner that we've just created. And now I'm going to do one last step, and I'm going to right-click on it, come down to Render Tags, go to the Redshift Object tag, and then in the Visibility tab of that tag, if you click the Override channel and uncheck the Primary Ray Visible, this will now be seen in all secondary rays, meaning reflections, shadows, those types of properties, but it will not show up as the object itself inside the render. Let me show you what I mean by that real quick. If I go to my Redshift render view, activate my IPR, let me just reset this a little bit so you can see it. So you can see that while the geometry is visibly present inside of our viewport, it is not actively rendering. If I go to the tag and I turn Primary Ray Visible back on, and refresh the IPR, you'll see those objects show up. If I turn it back off one more time to refresh, they go away, they disappear. And that's exactly what we want. So now we're just going to use the same methodology, and we're just going to create a couple of variants on this cloner to then basically use these as our lighting sources within the scene. So I'm just going to hold down the Control key, click and drag up to create a copy. We'll call this first one Rectangle Lights. And then we are going to change this one. We'll call it Dot Lights. And I'm actually just going to now craft or just create a sphere, scale the sphere way down because we don't need to see it. And I'm going to drop that into my Dot Lights cloner. And now if I just offset the Z position on this ever so slightly, you can see now we've moved it to a different point in the tube. And we're going to also change the radius on this just to be a little more narrow and add a few extra in count. And basically now we've created a different variant of this type of lighting, and we're also going to just create a different light color for it. So we'll have even more visual interest. So I held down Control and I dragged under on the material. That creates a copy of it. We will apply it to this dot lights object, and we're just going to change this to maybe an electric blue kind of color. And again, if I pull up my Redshift IPR, it's a little hard to see here, but I think you could probably see it, a little blue cast right in there. Hopefully that's showing up on the screen record. All right, so we've kind of got a couple of lights in scene. One thing I do want to make sure I also do is, again, we created all these selections, and my plan all along was that we were going to drop these same materials on these selections. So on the tube object, which I should rename coupler, I'm actually going to drop my orange light or my electric orange light. I'm going to apply the selection that I made for the outer rings into the selection tab. And then I'm going to apply the blue material and just grab the other selection tag for those inner rings and apply it there as well. And there you go. Basically, we've now crafted some semblance of lighting, and we can parametrically or procedurally adjust these as we go, right? So let's say that these blue lights are showing up a little too much, or we feel like the position on them is a little bit off. So we kind of want them a little closer together, or maybe even these rectangles. They're too bright, so we need them a little bit smaller. So we can kind of shrink the cubes down. We can add lights. We can take lights away. all of this is now going to be procedurally controllable, so we can have a high degree of control as we begin to move this animation and do its final steps. All right, so we've added some lighting, quote unquote, into the scene. Next step that we've got to do is really deal with how to material this tube itself. Right now, the environment has nothing in it. So Cinema will kind of attempt to fill it with default lighting, particularly when we just don't even have lights in the scene. And we don't want that to occur. We want this to be a pitch black environment. So the only thing that shows up are reflections. So I am going to actually add in, a little bit counterintuitive, but I'm going to add in, if I do Shift-C on the commander, and I start typing dome, I'm going to create a dome light. Now, by default, this dome light is going to come in as a white one intensity value. We don't need it to be anything for us except for something that blacks out the scene. So I'm actually just going to drop the color to black, and now we know that the scene is fully black. And if I open up the Redshift render view one more time and I hit render on the IPR, you can see the effect that that's already had in scene. Now there's no ambient light trying to come in, and the GI is not casting through this tube anymore. It's just a black world that this tube is only getting illuminated based off of these extra lights that we have tucked in here, these emissive materials that we've tucked in here. All right, I'm going to dock my IPR for these next couple of steps just so we can see what's happening. I don't really need to see the geometry quite as prominent, so I'm going to increase the scale of this a little bit. And now I'm going to come in, I'm going to create a new material, a standard material, and I'm going to turn the metalness up to 1. Now that immediately creates effectively a chrome-like material where it is purely reflective, and it is almost like turning the IOR down to 0. This is just a faster way of doing it. Notice if I change the IOR, nothing is changing on the material itself. So I can basically ignore the IOR now. That's all being controlled off the metalness. Now, how do I control some aspects of the metalness? Well, the roughness value still controls how rough the reflections are inside the metal. I'm going to set this to a relatively low value of 0.1. And then I don't really necessarily want this to be black metal. Chrome is more, in my mind, what I was trying to achieve. So I'm going to actually pull the base color up a little bit towards white. And as I do so, you'll start to see, maybe a little bit small on this material wall, but you'll start to see that it's actually getting a little bit closer to chrome. And pure white will mean that it is basically a clean chrome material. And again, it's similar to pulling the IOR down to 0. This is just a fast way of doing it. So if I take that material now and I apply it to the HeroTube sweeped object, very quickly, you'll notice a massive change in scene. And this is kind of the bulk of the effect. We are now inside of a mirror box because everything is reflecting. These dummy objects that we have tucked away that have the emissive material are now actually impacting not just the illumination of the scene, but the actual broad reflections and lighting. And because they are reflecting and there's bounces everywhere in the scene, they are crafting a general look like lighting inside of this tube. It's a super cool tactic and technique to learn. Honestly, again, this matches the same concept as a mirror box. We're just sort of applying it in a very different way. And as we change edges, as we work with edging, as we work with lights, as we add more interesting geometry into the scene, as we, come in here and we scale the radius of these circles up, these spheres up, it changes the overall appearance. And this is why it's so great to be able to keep some of these parameters parametric, is once you get the baseline in scene, you can really begin to art direct with a lot more finite control the way that this ends up looking. So maybe I want this to be a much longer run of rectangles. Maybe I want this to be more like 20 and 20, so it's a little bit thicker and adds a nice warmth to the scene with some blue highlight hits kind of running down the tube. All of this is something that I would strongly say is controllable by you as an artist, and I would just recommend a strong, put your mind's eye to it and have a blast while you're working. Couple of little cleanups that I'm noticing now that this is all in scene. I'm noticing a little bit of blockiness here, and I think that is because of our spline. Right now it is set to adaptive mode, which is a very imprecise method of adding intermediate points between all the ones that we actually applied into the scene. I'm going to switch this to subdivided. That's my fast cheat to smoothing this out. We could go into uniform and we can manually work through this. I just think subdivided, we're not going to be in a very heavy scene here, so I think subdivided will work well. The other thing I'm going to do, and I had mentioned this a little bit, I'm going to align some of the segmentation so it feels on the coupler, so it feels a little bit better as it is applying into this other cubes that are making up this tube. So I'm just going to grab the cube, and maybe it would help real quick. I'm going to shrink my IPR down a little bit. maybe it would help if I kind of back off the spline wrap and I really just kind of come back here to the main tube before it's wrapped, and I just grab the coupler and I just rotate it ever so slightly. And again, now you can sort of see that the segment is roughly in alignment here, and that should be good to go. One last thing that I'm noticing, the material, because I just applied it to the top of this null object, and I did have materials and selections on this bottom, or on the coupler, I actually do need to apply the material onto the coupler and then just put it at the bottom of the material stack here, stacking from left to right. So these are, as you move to the right on the order here, these materials appear above whatever is the leftmost material. And now you can see that there's actually more reflection on the coupler. It's not quite as just sort of black and non-detailed as it was a moment ago. All right, let me reactivate the spline wrap. And really, like I said, I feel like this is pretty good to go. Again, we're inside of this tube, and our animation is going to be flowing through it. So as I kind of run my camera down and I'm just sort of spot checking through the IPR, this is looking pretty sharp to me. I think it looks pretty cool. It feels very electric, feels very alive. And I think, honestly, our next step is really just to create the camera animation and actually start to bring this animation to life. Not a very complicated process to do that. I am going to kind of come back here roughly to the start point. I'm going to create a camera in scene. We'll call this main camera. And actually, before I do anything, I'm going to hold down Alt, and I'm going to make the camera a child of a null, and I'm going to call this, again, main camera. Now, the reason why I'm going to do that is this object now is going to be the one, the null object is going to be what I animate through the tube. And that allows me to have separate parameters that I can apply to the camera to allow sort of a secondary set of motion, but it will be locked in path to what this main camera is doing. So let's say I wanted to add a little bit of jiggle, or if I wanted to add an in or an out move, which is what I'm going to do in this instance. This allows me to control the in and out move through the main camera, while the general pathway is going to be controlled through this null. So if I drop this into my cameras folder here, I'm going to hold Shift-C on the keyboard. I'm going to grab an align to spline tag, and I'm going to make sure, again, that that is on the null. Now, we already drew our spline, so we know what we need to put in here. If I go down to the geometry folder and grab the hero tube spline and drop it into the spline path well, make sure that I am looking through the camera. The last switch I need to make sure I do is hit the tangential button. That way we are oriented at the spline at all times. Really simplistically, we are going to set a keyframe at frame 0 at 0%. And then if we move down the timeline to 120 frames, I'm now going to animate or drag along this keyframe. I don't know that I necessarily want to see the end of the tube, but we'll go to about 88%. And we will hit a keyframe there. So basically, we have now very quickly crafted an animation going from 0 to 88% of the spline, and that is creating our nice camera animation flowing down the tube. Now, again, we kind of need an in move and an out move. So I'm going to now grab my camera object, and I'm basically going to go to about frame 20. I'm going to set a keyframe on the Y coordinate, which right now is set to 0. I'm going to go back to frame 0, and I'm just going to offset the Y parameter down to being just right underneath this floor piece, right there. And set a keyframe. So now basically very quickly my camera is going to rise up into this tube, flow down the tube, and then about 20 keyframes from the end, so we'll put it at frame 100. We're going to set one more keyframe on the y-axis, come to frame 120, and we're going to go the opposite direction here. We're just going to push the camera up so that it is just reaching the top part of the wall. So now we've actually worked to create a little bit of the appearance of a loop. If I deactivate my IPR just to make sure playback is pretty clean here, if I hit play, we are running down the tube, we're flying through the tube, and then the camera flies up. And even in the viewport, this feels very clean as a loop. When we go to composite this, we'll actually trim a frame or two just to make sure that it feels that much cleaner. But now we've kind of created this endless flow through the tube and then move up to another tube kind of seamless animation. Again, freelance as you want. There's a lot of things you could do here. I'm just trying to craft something that's nice and concise and tight for the purposes of this tutorial. All right, so our primary animation is good to go here. Really now, I think just some secondary elements to kind of keep motion going through the camera at different rates is going to be a nice addition here. The, again, core idea was to be a fiber optic tunnel with data flowing through it. So I think there's a natural kind of inclination to maybe make some particles that are flowing down this tube, just some nice little extra bits that are supposed to represent data that's kind of running through this conduit. To do that, I could use an X particle simulation. To be honest, that is actually how I made the original, but I think that's going to be a little overkill in our current unique situation. I'm going to actually, in this case, use something a little more procedural and actually something that would be my go-to in a lot of circumstances, pending how I would need to control the particles. In this circumstance, I'm actually going to use a couple of particles that I've pre-made, so these kind of orb things. I won't get too into how I made these. I'm just going to include them with the file. You can break them down on your own. I have added onto them a Redshift object tag just so I'm not digging around, and I've given each one of them an object ID because I do know that I want to be able to extract these in post to be able to control them. So I'm going to just copy and paste these into my scene. And then what I'm going to do, if I drag this down to my Geo tab, I'm going to group these and I'm going to call these extra particles. Now what I'm going to do is actually add in a cloner object. And if I drag that under as well, basically now what I'm going to do is grab a matrix scatter object. Basically, a matrix scatter is a super lightweight data point that we can, using Redshift, actually assign a particle to it or add a streak to it, which is super powerful. I use them all the time. Great to keep your scene very lightweight while cloning a significant number of objects into the scene. Very simple build, though. We are going to make sure that our spline is at the top. Again, order of operations is kind of key here, but we're now going to switch the matrix object into object mode. Then we're going to drag our hero spline into the object mode. And if you'll see, there's one little dot that formed right there. Basically, we are now going to clone a ton of these matrix points onto this spline. Now, obviously, our camera is in direct alignment with the spline, so right now everything looks very locked together here. What we're going to do is actually just apply a random effector to this. And now we've sort of scattered those out, which is exactly what we want to kind of create a little bit of a varied look to things. And as I just kind of drag through it, you can sort of see that the particles have kind of scattered off of this this main hero spline. Now, they all are oriented one direction. I do want to come in and add some random rotation to the parameter to the random effector as well, just so that way they're not all oriented perfectly the same. And the last thing I'm actually going to do is grab a time effector as well, just so that way I can create a little bit of organic spin to these objects. If you do actually have to kind of hit play here, I'm going to jump out of my camera just to make sure that I can see this with a little bit of ease. But if I hit play, you'll see that they're just kind of spinning at a ratio of 90 degrees per second. I'm going to actually slow that down to about 25. I'm going to add a little bit to the pitch and a little bit to the bank as well. And because these have been randomly oriented, each one of them is kind of rotating on its own kind of newly assigned axis point. So it will feel a little bit unique per object. Again, order of operations. So the random effector is hitting it first, then the time effector. Okay, so now these particles are in scene, but they're also kind of just standing there, and they're not doing a lot. And I kind of want them to be flowing through the tube. Again, this is supposed to be data moving through the object. So how can we make that happen? Well, back in the matrix object, if we come down here, there's this rate and rate variation option. This is going to be our key step. Now, a little can go a long way here, so I'm actually going to pop out of my scene camera here real fast, just so I can see what the real rate of speed is for these. But if I hit play, you can see that now these are organically flowing down the tube. And I'm just going to notch this up ever so slightly until it hits about the speed that I want it to. We'll call 10 a good number there. And then we're going to increase the rate variation. So now there's just going to be some variation to how fast all these particles are flowing. This, I think we can crank all the way up to 100 because ultimately none of it is going to go negative. Maybe we'll go a little less than that just so that way they're all kind of flowing at least with some degree of steadiness. Now, if I pop back into my main camera, as we flow along, these particles are actually flowing in with the tube, almost in pace with the camera. Couple last adjustments. This is actually starting to feel maybe like a few too many particles. So I'm actually going to come into the matrix object and just bring my count down. We'll make it, we'll set it around 500. We'll see how that looks once it's all put together. Yeah, this is working okay for me, I think. And then a very last step here is because this is all running through Redshift, we're actually going to go into the Redshift object tag that's now on the Redshift matrix object, and we're going to, in the particles tab of it, add a custom object. And then those two orbs that we created, we're going to drag into the custom object well here. And now each one of these orbs is going to be sequentially applied to these objects, or in our case, we're going to change that to a random distribution so that the orange and the blue orb are randomly being applied into the scene. Now let me open up my Redshift render view so we can see what that actually looks like in practice. It's just going to take a second to render. Okay, these are way too big right off the bat, and that's because of the orb size. It's not actually a problem here. The orb size just needs to be brought down. We could either scale the orbs down themselves, or I'm just going to cheat it and change the scale multiplier down to a number like 0.1, maybe even 0.01, just to make sure. Oh, nope, that's a little too small, maybe 0.05. Yeah, that's feeling okay to me here. So as I kind of am just dragging through, there's some variance, and now we can actually see what the final appearance is going to be. Maybe I do want a few more in number here. It's always a little tricky when you're playing with the viewport versus actually generating these particles right in front of you. Yeah, we'll go with 650. That's feeling okay to me for right now. And we'll kind of call this good for these secondary particles. I think that's a nice little extra touch. And from here, I think we can move on to prepping for render. All right, one quick reminder before we get too deep into the render settings. We are working in an OpenColor.io interface, which means we are running ACCG through the entirety of Cinema 4D. That is great because that means we don't have to worry about setting that up through the Redshift renderer. But we do have a couple of things to set up, so let's get into that real quick. I'm going to open up my Redshift IPR. I'm going to open up my render settings. I'll put them side by side. You'll notice I have sort of preset my threshold down to a very low value of 1. That's purely for the speed of us kind of stepping through the next couple of moments. But really, I will be increasing this as we get ready to actually hit the final render here. So go over to my globals tab. One thing to address here is actually just to take a peek at your trace depths. Now, we're not going to get too into working through any of these. Actually, my image looks pretty fine, but I wanted to at least give you a sense of what they would do and how they can help you, specifically reflection, because we are reflecting so many things within the scene. Trace depths essentially mean how many bounces of these reflections should exist in the world. So if I increase them, you'll notice very quickly that actually we get a much brighter result. There's more bounces of reflection happening throughout the scene. So we are almost adding more illumination into the scene because that is how our scene is actually being illuminated. If I notch this down below 4, it actually begins to darken the scene because we're limiting the number of bounces that each one of these lights can make within the scene. Now, for me, I thought 4 looked good, so I'm not going to adjust this, but I did want to call that out as a means by which you may want to go and play around with this setting as you're building yours, because ultimately how you built it, how it's looking, you may need a few more traces even just to get it where you want it to, or a few fewer traces because it's way overkill. One way or the other, it's important to note that that's what this setting will handle. In addition to all of these settings, essentially this is what they all kind of control, but just wanted to kind of call that out as one little tip for you. Okay, jumping into AOVs. We're not going to set up too many AOVs here. The first one we're going to do is a depth pass. We're not going to, pretty standard here. This is just so I can get some depth of field in post or add a little bit of depth haze. We're going to set the filter type to center sample. I'm going to switch the depth mode to Z normalize, and I'm going to use the camera near far as an option here. That's pretty much set up, ready to go. With that, we're going to do a puzzle mat. Now, this one I'm going to use to isolate all the little data orbs that we've added into the scene so we can kind of play with those in post. So I'm going to call this orbs. I'm going to switch the mode from material ID to object ID. And if I come in here and grab, running a little bit out of room, and I grab my extra particles, you'll notice that in the Redshift object tag, I've actually added an object ID override into each one of these. So the orange ball is 1, the blue ball is 2. So I'm just going to actually punch those values in here. And basically now if I switch my pass over to the orbs, you'll see that now we actually have a color isolation for each one of the orbs. And that's great because that'll let me isolate them out individually, meaning I can just grab the green or the red color here to isolate out just that one orb set. Or I can just use the saturation value of this and grab all the orbs as a cluster and begin to manipulate those in post, which is great. All right, last setup that we're going to do here, if I go back to my beauty pass real quick, we are actually going to add one more puzzle mat into my scene. Again, sorry, a little bit tight on real estate. This one I am going to call
lights. Now, how are we going to isolate our lights when we actually don't have any lighting in the scene? And by lights, I mean all of these little beautiful reflections and all of this stuff. You know, maybe it's a little undersaturated. Maybe I need a little more vibrance. Maybe I need to shift the orange a little more red or the blue a little more green. Who knows? There's a lot of reasons why we may want to isolate this out, but ultimately, because this is a reflection and these are not actual lights, what is the best way to do this? Well, there's an amazing switch within the puzzle mat that we'll get to in one quick second. But the first thing we're going to do is actually set this up similar to how we did with the orbs. We're going to switch this to Object ID. Now, inside of my hero tube with these dot lights and rectangular lights objects, on their Redshift object tag, I've also overridden and added an object ID. The blue lights are 10, the orange lights are 20, so I'm going to punch these in as 10 and 20. And the reason for 10 and 20, not a big deal, but for me, for organization, I like to do things in blocks of 10. Now, if I switch over to the puzzle mat for it, it's black right now. There's absolutely no data showing. And that's because the objects are not visible to the camera because we intentionally hid them. So how do we get that data? Well, there's this amazing little box right here called Reflect Refract IDs. And in essence, what that will do is it will isolate wherever the reflections or refractions of those objects are visible, and it will also give you data for that. And this is exactly what I was hoping to get. So now we can actually isolate those little color hits, those little color reflections, and manipulate those in post. This is an amazing little switch that I wish I had been cued in on a little bit earlier in my career. It would have saved me a lot of heartburn. But the truth is, I know it now and wanted to pass this tip on to you. It's an amazing little tip, especially if you ever do a lot of compositing with glass, a lot of compositing with reflection or chrome type materials. This is a great, great, great little trick. All right. With that, we're basically ready to render here. Let me grab my render settings back up. I am going to set my sampling down to 0.01. I did a little bit of work before recording this tutorial to know that that value is going to be good enough. Now, the key here is good enough to get it out of 3D that you know you can kind of fix things in post if they come up. I will use denoisers all the time in post. I will use cleanup in post all the time. So good is good enough. I don't need perfect out of 3D. I don't want to waste the render time for that. And I also rarely will use the denoiser. I find that introduces a lot of errors when you're rendering it out of 3D. Okay, so with that last little tidbit to make sure that we are going to be rendering OpenEXR sequences. My standard setup for this is PXR 24s with 16-bit float. Make sure you are in 32-bit per channel depth, not 16-bit, because if you're in 16-bit, the image color profile actually ends up reverting back to sRGB, which is completely negating the ACES format, but we want 32-bit, so it's in a linear color space. We will match that into the multipass, and from there, we are good to set this up for rendering. With that, I will pick this back up in After Effects. All right, before we get into the After Effects side of things, just a quick pause to say that if you're enjoying this tutorial, make sure you hit that like button down below and follow and subscribe to the School of Motion channels to stay up to date on all the latest tutorials, insights, and discussions from School of Motion. Helping you get better as an artist is the goal. All right, let's wrap this tutorial up. All right, so now inside of After Effects, you'll see that I've already kind of got my project imported, or my renders imported. I am, just to make sure you guys see this, I am working in the OCIO color managed ACES 1.2 space with ACES CG being my base color, and then I'm using a display transform to Rec 709 again. Go back and watch the tutorial I previously did for School of Motion if you want a little more detail in terms of how to set up an OCIO pipeline from Cinema 4D to After Effects. I do it pretty thoroughly in that tutorial, so I'm going to spare all that information in this one. And in my head, really, for color correction here, I kind of want to add a little bit more contrast to the scene. I want to make sure that this feels nice and illuminated, nice and punchy and bright and vibrant. Not too much, you know, obviously there's sort of a line where it starts to look a little Tellison. So we're going to kind of balance all this stuff out. And I think we'll be in pretty good shape with a little bit of color correction, a little bit of vibrancy, a little bit of glow, and some depth of field here. So not too crazy of a composite. Won't take us too long to do. First thing I'm going to do, and I do have my beauty pass in the scene. I have the puzzle mat for the kind of glowing data orbs that we created. And then I have another one for all the reflection and light refraction that I showed you while we were in Cinema 4D. Last but not least, we also have our depth pass. All right, so first up, we're going to deal with these kind of orbs. So I'm going to add the set matte effect
onto a duplicated layer of my beauty pass. I'm going to make sure that I select the puzzle mat that had all of those, so this puzzle mat here, as my matte layer, and then I'm going to make it the saturation detail within that layer to pull this matte. Now, basically, because I'm not too worried about isolating the orange versus the blue, I can always do that later if I need to, if the blue is feeling a little wrong or the orange needs a little bit of a tint. Right now, I'm really just trying to isolate these orbs themselves. I always like to have a little more data than less data, and the easy way to do that is the saturation on that layer as opposed to separating a red or a green channel. All right, so from there, I am going to now add an optical glow effect. It will black out the background of the scene right away. All we need to do is come down to the alpha channel and change that to be extend. And then from here, I always like to kind of do a double glow kind of effect. So we're going to leave the amount right now at 25, but I'm going to set the size to 1. Maybe I'll punch up the amount a little bit here in one quick second. And then I'm going to actually duplicate that optical glow. And now I'm going to almost invert this. I'm just going to do an amount of 1, but then I'm going to set the size to actually be quite a large number. There is some detail on these orbs that I feel like is actually getting a little bit lost. So you know what I'm going to do is actually add in a curves layer. Just put that right in front of the optical glow. And I'm just going to add a little bit of an S-curve onto it just to make sure that those pieces kind of feel nice and punchy and vibrant to them. And that's feeling pretty good to me there. As I'm looking at it, though, now those orbs almost feel too bright and vibrant, and we kind of need to balance in the rest of the scene to make that match. So I'm actually just going to do a little house cleaning, rename this to, say, orbs, and then I will call this BG. I'm going to now actually duplicate my BG layer. I'm going to add a set matte effect onto it, and then I'm going to grab the lighting pass that we pulled, and now I'm going to set that to saturation as well. And if I solo this, really, you can see it's just all of these specular and kind of gloss hits that are on the scene. If I wanted to, I could actually go with the red channel. That'll isolate the blues. I can do the same thing on the green channel. That'll isolate the oranges. Really, for right now, though, I'm just kind of looking for a nice smattering of both. I don't need all of them. But from here, I'm actually going to do a similar tactic that I did for the orbs. I'm going to grab an optical glow effect. Set this to be extended on the alpha. I'm going to bring the size down to just a little bit, so 25 on the amount and then 1 on the radius. And then I'm going to duplicate it, and we're going to invert that. So now I'm going to go 2 on the amount, and then the size I'm going to kind of glow outward. And now I kind of have a nice set of punchiness running through the scene. Now, this is, to me, reading hyper-saturated, and I don't want that. And I also am looking at the general scene, and I feel like I need a little bit more kind of contrast within the scene. Now, some of this is going to be helped with depth of field, and I can actually use the depth layer to add a little bit of haze running through the tunnel, so it's not just all kind of one perfectly clear image running through it. But for right now, I'm actually going to just very simply start out by doing a quick color correction on the entire plate. First thing I'm going to do then is actually grab the OCIO color space transform, because I prefer to color grade at least on a baseline using a log color type space, and ACES provides you one. So we're going to actually transform from ACES CG to ACES CC. Then we're going to actually add in a lumetri color effect. Now we're in log, and we're going to color correct off of log by doing this. We don't want to actually finish in log, though, so we're going to duplicate this layer one more time, and we're going to actually now go from ACES CC to ACES CG, so kind of doing the round trip here. And now we're going to just do all of our color correction kind of in this in-between layer. I don't think we need to do a ton here, though we do need to do a couple of pretty vital steps. I think the first thing we're going to do is just maybe pull down a little bit of the exposure. Not a ton, just enough. And then we're going to actually kind of come in and we're going to boost up our highlights, and maybe we will knock down our shadows. And that's kind of creating a little bit more of a dark, contrasty, moody type environment. And that's really allowing these colors to pop. That said, the colors are feeling almost a little too much for me right now. And this gets into, it's all a little bit of your preference. I tend to like to go with realism. And one thing that's actually true about the real world, it's a lot less saturated than what we tend to be able to create with computer imagery. So I'm going to, for my sensibility, just bring the saturation down ever so slightly. So really, we're just pulling out about 25% of the overall saturation. It's always good to do kind of a before after. So this is the after, that's the before. before, after. This is feeling pretty good to me just on a basic color correction. I may apply a quick LUT here. I tend to like the Kodak 2395 just as a baseline that comes with Lumetri. It's way too strong right off the top, so I'm going to actually throttle this down to, we'll call it about 33%, 30. We'll call it a value of 30. Yeah, so again, without it and with it, it just adds a little bit of nice warm contrast into the scene, in my opinion. And again, one more time, now we'll just kind of throttle down the saturation just ever so slightly so we're feeling a little more like safe ranged here instead of it being over the top too much. All right, one last thing we're going to do in Lumetri before we move on from it is I'm going to actually grab a vignette or go down to the vignette. I'm going to push it negative so I kind of darken in some of the corner edging here, and that'll really kind of bring a little bit of a nice focus into the middle of the frame. All right, so our color correction's done now. Now really what we're going to do is actually add in our depth of field. Last tutorial, I actually used a free plugin that's available within After Effects. This time, I'm actually going to use a purchased plugin. I use it all the time. It is called Fast Bokeh. If you apply the depth matte into the depth matte layer and then you turn up the blur radius, if you actually buy the plugin, there is a trial, but if you buy the plugin, you can actually then go and just very quickly select a spot in frame, and that will now become your focal depth. And that is a really fast, really nice way to kind of create some good-looking depth of field with bokeh. There's a lot of controls within this. One of my kind of quick go-tos is actually to make this look a little more ocular by adding a polygon-shaped iris and then kind of condensing it down to more of an anamorphic parameter. And there, like I said, a lot of random kind of settings that you can play with here. I don't want to spend too much time on it. I think this is going to work pretty well. The only thing I might do is actually come in and add a little bit of intensity back into some of these back hot orbs. That way they kind of punch a little bit from the scene. And I can kind of play with my threshold a little bit just to make sure that I'm isolating the right regions. Maybe I'll kind of punch this a little bit hotter. That's a little too far. We'll call somewhere around there pretty good. But this is actually feeling pretty good to me. Ultimately, a lot of these decisions will come down to however you want the final image to look. I could kind of tweak this all day, but I do think the one last thing that we should add in here ultimately is Real Smart Motion Blur. Again, this is a paid plugin. You could use Pixel Motion Blur if you want. I tend to find that I lean on this one quite a bit. I think this is actually looking pretty good. I'll let you know if I make any last adjustments in the downtime here, but otherwise I'm going to prep this to render. And in doing that, the one thing you do just want to make sure that you do, again, we're working in ACES. We want to master this into 709, so we're going to come in here, we're going to change our output module, go to the color tab, and just make sure that we set this to be output Rec 709 or output sRGB if you're going for display color. In my case, Rec 709 is the right one. And I will pick this back up to wrap up the tutorial in just a quick second. All right, and with that, we're going to call this our final product. I did make a couple of last little adjustments here that I'll kind of run over with you real quick. The very first thing that I did was actually, I will usually create something I kind of call a lensing layer. I don't know why I always kind of call it that, but really it's just sort of a finishing layer to kind of bring all the work I've done kind of together a little bit cleaner. And while I'll use a few different tools, Magic Bullet Looks is actually a pretty good one to be able to work with in this sense. And really, it's kind of a combination of adding a little bit of lens distortion. That way, it kind of feels a little bit more like how a camera naturally would be capturing things. A little bit of chromatic aberration. I'm not sure how well that's translating, but that gives you a little bit more lens artifacting. In this circumstance, particularly because of the amount of illumination, a little bit of haze, because technically speaking, light as it's passing through the lens of a camera should have some kind of an ocular effect to it. And again, a little bit of halation, that's kind of a similar to chromatic aberration, just a little bit of color disruption in the scene. And then, of course, last but not least, a little bit of noise over the top will always usually go a long way into adding a little bit of a believable kind of finish here. So I added that over top of my composition before I rendered it. That's really it, though. That's really kind of the final product here. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial a lot. I hope you were able to pick up lots of tips and tricks, particularly around how really simple builds can actually yield really dynamic results. And I hope that inspires you to go be creative on your own and come up with whatever ideas you possibly can using some of these techniques, or even just expanding these techniques into your own work. Make sure that if you enjoyed this tutorial, you hit that like and subscribe button down below, and head on over to schoolofmotion.com to check out all the course offerings and keep this education journey rolling. Thanks again, and until next time, I'm David Rickels.